This week, I've got The Naked Gun. This is continuing on in the franchise that originally starred the late Leslie Nielsen, and this time around, we've got Liam Neeson picking up in the role of Frank Drebin Jr. He is playing the son of the police squad member played by Leslie Nielsen, and I'm going to potentially blaspheme for a moment right now and admit that I don't think I've actually seen the entirety of the original Naked Gun film. I have seen bits and pieces for sure, but I don't know if I've ever sat down and watched the entire thing all the way through. So the good news is that does not matter going into this 2025 film, right? Like, the plot is paper thin, so that's not a concern. I am sure there are homages and references to the original film, and I know a bunch of my friends picked up on them and found it entertaining, but I had a great time at this movie without needing any additional input. So good news on that front. And boy, I had a great time at this movie, but it is so stupid. And I mean that in the most complimentary way possible. I don't think I've seen just a broad comedy like this in a really long time. I joked and I said it has the highest bit rate of any film I've seen in the last, I can't even remember how long. It is going purely for jokes. And as a byproduct of that, yeah, the plot, like I said, is barely there. I mean, it's there, but it's not necessarily important for the enjoyment of the movie. So, like I said, you have Liam Neeson in this starring role as Frank Drebin Jr., and he is funny as the straight man who is ridiculous and self-serious, and it's, you know, a pretty great casting. Pamela Anderson plays against him in a character called Beth Davenport. I think she is giving a great comedic performance here. You know, after seeing The Last Showgirl, I was like, cool, I'm really excited for her to have this resurgence, and I think this is a great follow-up that is well within her range, and so great job on that. The supporting cast is rounded out by Paul Walter Hauser, CCH Pounder, Kevin Durand, and Danny Houston, and then it is just peppered with cameos. And like I said, this is a film that is just jokes in a very fun way, and some of the jokes are so nonsensical that's one of my favorite types of bit, right? Where it's just like, it doesn't matter, but we're committing to it. Some of them are actually shockingly clever, and some of them are just so absurd. And the other thing I appreciate about it is, like, yes, there is an okay amount of juvenile humor, you know, body humor in it, but it is not relying too hard on that. Like, the moments that they did employ that tactic or those motifs, I was actually like, okay, I'm okay with this. There are a couple of moments that gave me Austin Powers callback vibes, but overall, I just laughed through this entire movie. And I was even trying to decide, do I go see this movie again? Because I know I laughed over a lot of the jokes. I think because the plot is kind of thin, I don't know if I would sit through it again so recently, but this is a movie that I can already tell is going to, you know, have a huge replay value when it does come out on streaming, whenever that happens. But I am actually going to encourage you to see this in a theater, in a communal setting, because while the action or the acting it's whatever, it's that feeling of laughing along with other people that is so wonderful, and it's why we go to the movies, and it's why we see movies in theaters. And, you know, they showed this kind of cheesy thing. There was like Rescue a Comedy at the beginning. It showed these great kind of not even that old classic comedy films. I was like, yeah, I love movies like this. I have not gotten, like, this has scratched an itch that I didn't realize was happening. So I had a wonderful time. Like, this is a movie that I was like, oh, I'm excited to tell my parents about this. They are a barometer and a lens through which I often am viewing films of, because they always ask, they're like, oh, have you seen this? Have you seen that? And I'm like, yeah, I think, you know, it wasn't so gross that I'd feel uncomfortable being like, you should go see this movie. It was silly enough and broad enough that they're not going to ask hardcore plot questions. And also, it's just a good time. The other thing I love about this movie is that I don't think it punches down, which is a very easy trap to fall into in a film like this, especially with kind of like a homogenous lead team. I'm just going to say what it is. But I think this movie knows that the character that Liam Neeson is playing is close to, you know, the Leslie Nielsen character. And I think there is a world in which this would have felt outdated and out of place, or like I said, it was punching down. But they have figured out a way to navigate that situation and actually make it very funny and turn it into one of the strengths. So I had a great time at this. I think the only reason I'm not like, oh, this is a 5 out of 5 is because the plot is so thin. This movie is 85 minutes. I think if it had been a minute over that, I would have transcended into the miserable territory instead of being like, this is a delightful, fast-paced, fun movie. But because, again, I'm like, I think there's a world in which we maybe could have adjusted the plot a little bit or given it a little more meat. They've over-indexed on the bits in exchange. I'm going to give this a 4.2 out of 5. But aside from that part, if you're willing to overlook, there's no reason not to see this film. The next film I have is The Bad Guys 2. This is an animated film, and I was looking back at my review of the first film, which again, it's one of those movies where I know I've academically seen it, and yet none of it has stuck in my brain. Turns out I was not a huge fan of the first Bad Guys film. It has clearly purged from my brain, and so I went into this with a relatively clean slate, and of course I always go in with an open mind, but I wasn't coming in with any positive preconceived notions, but I also was willing to see the film. It wasn't so horrendous the first time around that I went, I will never see a Bad Guys film. So, the good news, much like The Naked Gun, you don't need to know anything or remember anything in order to enjoy The Bad Guys 2. They're probably aware that either you've forgotten or haven't rewatched or never even maybe saw the first film, and so you can quite easily drop into this franchise. In fact, this is one of those times where I'm like, yeah, you don't technically have to have seen the first one in order to understand and appreciate the second one. I do get the sense, and again, I didn't go super detailed into my review or rewatch the first one, but I get the sense they've actually improved a little bit upon it. I think this kind of like Naked Gun has like a pretty thin plot, and you are here for some of the jokes. In the same way that The Naked Gun is made by people who clearly love comedy, The Bad Guys 2 is clearly actually, in this case, being written by people who love movies, because there are a lot of movie references in it that I was like, oh, all right, I enjoy this. Is a little kid gonna understand this? Absolutely not, but it did help band-aid my experience as, an adult moviegoer without children with me. So, pretty all-star voice cast. You've got Sam Rockwell returning as Mr. Wolf. He is our big bad wolf, kind of lead of this gang of ne'er-do-wells who have now gone good. You've got Mark Maron, Craig Robinson, Anthony Ramos, Awkwafina, Zazie Beetz, Richard Ayoade, Alex Borstein, and this time around they are joined by Danielle Brooks, Natasha Lyonne, and Maria Bakalova. And again, the plot, very simple. The rules of this world are the thing that I have been scratching my head about and now have even more questions coming out of it than I had going into it. And I don't know if this is a necessary thing for the story to answer. We're just gonna have to hand wave across here, but I'm like, I don't understand how there are anthropomorphic animals who, a shark and a piranha that can breathe and exist outside of water. And yet there are also like regular fish in this. The piranha's in a fish tank full of non-speaking fish at some point. The bad guys have a pet cat that doesn't speak. Interspecies animals are allowed to date. And then like, who are the humans supposed to be? And also anthropomorphic animals can hold elected office. I'm just like, where's the line? What's happening here? Like, who's allowed to be what? What makes you, evolve into a speaking creature versus remaining as like a fish creature? I would like to know. I might be in the minority here and thinking more about this than it deserves. I think the film moves along fine. It has a relatively straightforward plot that any little old kid could follow, because I do think ultimately this is still geared towards younger audiences. I'm not saying this to impugn it, but it is where it is kind of indexing towards. Much like The Naked Gun, this moves along pretty quickly, although I find it ironic that this animated film is actually longer than The Naked Gun. You don't see that too often. I think, little kids were certainly laughing at certain parts in the film, not the same parts that the adults were laughing in. The animation style is interesting to me. There are times where they dip into these more fun, stylized moments, and I gravitate towards those. I could see a world in which you overutilize those and it would become gimmicky and boring, but, I was like, ooh, I do want to see you push a little bit more. I think the textures and the visuals of some of the characters are actually really interesting, but then somehow it all feels sameness, and, maybe the average audience member isn't going to notice things. I always note that I have an animation background, so I get stuck on some of these things, but will you have a good time at this movie is the ultimate question. I think if you have kids, totally fine. This is better than some of the other animated movies I saw of late that I'm not going to throw under the bus too much, but you can check my previous reviews. So I found it much more palatable than the last one, but I don't think this is necessarily going to stand out in like the pantheon of great animated films. It was solid. It moved along. I do think they tightened up a little bit, in part because they're not trying to origin story in this one. They're just like, hey, here we are. Here are the roles these folks fill. We're a little expositional with it, but understandable given the circumstances. So if you have little kids, I think you're going to have a decent time at this. If you are an adult and just a fan of animation, like I am, I don't know if you need to see this in a theater. If you're interested, it's decent enough, and I'm not like you have to skip it completely. There are plenty of films that have cautioned people away from after having seen them. This doesn't fall into that category. I don't feel as negatively towards this as apparently I did the first one, so maybe they have in fact improved and iterated. overall, I actually had an okay time. Perhaps this is also coasting off of my buoyancy after having seen The Naked Gun, because I saw these the day after each other, so I was still in a good mood. I am going to give this a 3.7 out of 5.